Designing an Active Directory permissions model. Now, this isn't so much about how you apply permissions in Active Directory, but how are you going to choose to apply permissions? What approach are you going to take to securing Active Directory and delegating administration? We've got a variety of things to talk about, and a lot of these are going to revolve around things you can do with permissions in Active Directory, so you kind of understand what tools you have available to you for designing your permissions model. We'll start with the basics of working with permissions, and I'll cover some of the pros and cons of different approaches that I've seen people take. We're going to talk about delegation in two different ways. The first way will be delegating control from a sort of a business perspective. In other words, we've got other people in the organization that we want to give permission to do certain things, and so we're going to delegate those permissions or that control to them. We're also going to talk about the physical configuration of Kerberos credential delegation, and when you might need to do that and how to go about doing so. We'll talk about Active Directory quotas, getting the Active Directory client tools out to your whoever needs them, and the admin SD holder delegation. The CBT Nuggets series for exam 70-410 complements this and provides a little bit of additional coverage for permissions management. The specific task of how to configure user rights, for example, and how to delegate creation and management of AD objects. Now, that's something we're still going to look at, but we're going to cover it more from the why and the how would you approach it perspective than the actual buttons you would click to do it. So it's a good complement. If you've got a chance, you should definitely review that information, and that'll help kind of round out your AD permissions management education. While I'm a big fan of the new Active Directory Administrative Center, the fact is when you're going to be managing permissions in Active Directory, you're going to be spending most of your time in the Active Directory Users and Computers console. And it's important to make sure you pop up to the View menu and turn on Advanced Features, or you won't actually see most of the security stuff. So just to start with the basics so that we can build from there, I'm going to right-click on an organizational unit, select Properties, and then go to its Security tab. This is the basis of Active Directory permissions management right here. There's a couple of downsides to managing permissions this way. And understand, this is your main choice for managing permissions, but there are a couple of downsides to it. One is that every single container has its own property sheet like this, meaning if you're trying to go through and really make extensive changes to permissions, you've got a lot of dialog boxes to click through. It also means it can be tough sometimes to track down exactly who has permission to what, because there's no central repository for these permissions. They're all spread out across all of the organizational units as well as the individual objects themselves. But once you're in, it's easy enough to hop in and quickly get an overview of who has access to what. The Everyone group, for example, has deny on delete all child objects for this organizational unit. We can get down and say, oh, this is the pain, special permissions. That means you need to click through to the Advanced tab. Now, this really lists all of the individual permissions. We can spread this out a little bit just to get a better view of it. So we can see that everyone has this deny and the access is special, which means we need to click Edit to bring it up. And this will tell us exactly what they have denied to. So they're denied to this object's deletion, deleting any subtrees, all these different checkboxed permissions. These are denied to that group. One of the reasons, by the way, that you're seeing this everyone deny is part of Active Directory's accidental deletion prevention. Here, you know what, let me create a new organizational unit and I'll show you where that actually starts out. So we'll right-click, New Organizational Unit, Protect Container from Accidental Deletion. We'll just call this Ops. Checking that checkbox is actually what applied that deny permission to everyone. That's how accidental deletion is prevented. If I come in here and look at the properties of this, you can see that that's actually kind of gone now until we get over to this tab. I'll uncheck it, hit apply, then we'll go back over to the security tab and you'll see that that deny is missing here. We'll go through to advanced. You'll see that everyone still has a deny, but it's not on all the same things. It's just a much smaller set. See how there's many, many fewer checkboxes selected? So all of that deny came from that protect object from accidental deletion checkbox. That's how that actually gets implemented under the hood. So of course you have the ability to determine the effective access to this. So let's go in and select a user. This tells me, given all of the inherited permissions and all of the denies and grants and everything else, what is this particular user's effective permissions on that particular organizational unit. And you can scroll down and see every single thing that they are allowed or not allowed to do. This is an effective tool. Effective tool, but it's a good tool because managing permissions can be difficult. You'll notice that permissions can be inherited. Now, this doesn't have any permissions on the top of the list that are inherited. These are all applied directly to that OU, but some of these permissions are coming down from a higher level. And as you start to get more deeply nested organizational units and you apply permissions at different places on each one, that constant inheriting can make it really tough to figure out what someone's real permission is. And that's what that effective permissions tab is all about. So those are the kind of core basics of where permissions come from and where you manage them. Now we can start building on that to cover some of the more complicated permission design scenarios. Now we do want to offer a quick word on a general approach. And when you look at one of these property sheets again, let me pull up the security tab for sales again. Properties, security. When you look at this, you start to think, wow, I could definitely see how these would get complicated. If you really want to start delegating permissions out to other people in your organization so that you, the domain admin, don't have to do all the work, this list is going to start to get really long and really complicated and really difficult to manage. And one huge thing you can do to make life easier on yourself is never put a user account on this page. In other words, when you're adding, let's check names here. What you don't want to see is a user icon. That's a disabled user icon. It's a disabled user account. Don't worry about that. That's not really relevant. You don't ever want to have users on this list. You really want to restrict things to groups. And if you can create groups that represent job roles within your organization, if you're going to have office administrators who are going to reset people's passwords or whatever, create a group for them. And if you've got 5 different segments of those, maybe you've got an office administrator in each one of your geographic locations, create separate groups for those. That way, as human beings move around inside your organization, you don't have to come back to this complicated properties sheet again. You can simply manage the membership of those groups. So assign permissions to groups and then move users in and out of those groups. It's much, much easier to manage the membership list of a group than it is to manage all of these complicated permissions. You get in here and you start really looking at the details of these permissions, and they can get quite complicated. And you've got an incredibly long list here, and if you pop into any single one of these, let's see, edit this one. You've got all of the gazillions of checkboxes that have to be checked and unchecked and denied and allowed. It just gets tough. Much better to do it once. Set it up once, get it right, assign permissions to a user group, and then just take the much easier task of moving users in and out of those groups. So for the rest of this nugget, I'm going to assume that that's the approach you're going to take, and you'll primarily see me referring to groups. You'll know the reason I'm not talking a lot about user accounts is because they shouldn't be involved in permission assignment. Now, when the time does come to start delegating control over Active Directory out to different people in your organization, you've got 2 ways of doing it. Both result in the same end product, or at least a similar end product. It's 2 ways of kind of going about it. The first is to use the Delegation of Control wizard. And one thing I like about the Delegation of Control wizard is it makes this a fairly sensible process. So first, who am I going to delegate control to? Now, I do have a group for the office admins in my organization, so I'm going to delegate some control to them. You can actually run through this wizard several different times to successively delegate more permission to that same group. But you can start with these common tasks. I want to give them the ability to reset user passwords, to read all user information, and I'd like to be able to let them modify some of the attributes of users, but I don't see a pre-done task for that. So that's okay. We're going to come through this a couple of times then. So I'm just going to do these pre-created permission sets first. And because I'm using a pre-created permission set, that's all I have to do. I'm delegating control over this organizational unit to this user group, and the control I'm delegating is this. So this is the new task they'll be able to perform. Hit finish and you're done. Now for that custom task, users have got, let's take a look here. Some of the attributes we've got. I really might want my office admins just to be able to keep this basic address information up to date, maybe some of this organizational information, and maybe some of these telephones. So let's go back to the sales group or organizational unit, and I'm going to right click and I'm going to run the delegation of control wizard again. I'm still going to delegate to the office admins group, but this time the permissions I'm going to delegate is going to have to be a custom task. So what do I want to delegate control of? Let's see. Every object in this folder and creation of new objects? No, I don't want to do that. I really just want them to be able to do stuff with user objects, nothing else. I don't want them creating the new type of object in this folder, and I don't want them deleting anything. So I'm leaving those checkboxes cleared. All right, now this is where the permissions can get really, really sticky. So all of these general permissions, which is what's displayed right now, I don't want them reading and writing all properties. So I'm going to uncheck the general permissions and get down to property-specific permissions. And this is where this list, you wish you could make this dialog box a little bit bigger. So I'm going to have to scroll through here and find every single property. Ooh, I want them to be able to read and write the assistant information. Business category, comment, company. I'd like them to be able to change that. Department number, description. So you can go through and granularly decide every single permission that you want them to be able to do. Oh, I wanted them to do department number. I'm going to go check a couple of others. Direct reports, not display name. Division, not employee ID. Fax number, let's do that. And so you kind of see where I'm going. I'm not going to go through and do a bunch of these. The reason I'm selecting several of these, though, is that I do want to let you see what the end result of this looks like. So again, review what you've done. There's all the permissions we're delegating for user objects. So here we go, finish. Now, what happened? Well, under the hood, it really just modified that same property sheet we were looking at. The delegation of control wizard doesn't do anything magical. It's just an easier, friendlier way of modifying that underlying complicated property sheet. So let's go in here now and take a look at that property sheet directly. Now you can see here Office Admins does have special permissions allowed, which means I'm going to have to click through to Advanced to start seeing what those are. And look what it's done to the property sheet. Office Admins, Office Admins, Office Admins, Office Admins, Office Admins, Office Admins. When I went through just now and I picked those custom properties, it created a permission on this dialog box for each property attribute permission that I set up. I'll show you what I mean. Let's go look at this one. This is an allow, and we're going to have to scroll through until I see the checkbox that this permission entry is for. There it is. This entry is just for the department number. Let's pick this one now. This entry is just for the division, right? So every single one of those custom attributes, those granular attributes that I delegated permission over, has resulted in an individual entry in this list. That, in my opinion, is a huge pain in the neck for future maintenance. That's one of the reasons that when I get down to a custom task in the delegation of control wizard, I often will not use the wizard. Instead, and here's what I'm going to do, since we're just playing around. So this is read all properties. That's fine. We'll leave that one there. It should be the only other one for office admins. Okay. So I'm going to grab all of these ones. And there's the reset password one. I'm just going to remove all of these. Remove. There we go. All right, so these two permissions given to Office admins were the pre-created tasks, the ability to reset passwords and read all properties. So remember, I still wanted to be able to delegate the ability for them to change certain attributes. That's when I went through the wizard with the custom task, and that's when it added all of those entries. I'm going to add Office admins manually. And I'm going to allow, and I'm going to allow it to this object. Now, actually, let's just call it all descendant objects. So everything in the OU. And I need to be able to list the contents, read all properties, read permissions, that's fine. But now I can go down to these individual attributes, and instead of writing all properties, I can just pick the exact ones I want. And I can pick them all in this individual entry. So once I went through and yeah, I'm sure. Once I went, oh, you see what it does? Even if you check those checkboxes individually, it creates all of those entries. Yeah, that's the downside. It was kind of a surprise the first time I saw it too. And it's something that trips people up. If you really sit down with someone and you want to see if they know Active Directory deep, you'll ask them that. Okay, so you went through the delegation and control wizard and it set up all those entries. Well, how could you get all those down to one? Well, I guess I could go in and check all the check. Ah, yes, but if you do that, it really just still creates all those individual entries. It's a trip up point in Active Directory. So I wanted to make sure you saw this. So the idea is that every single one of these now is for a specific individual permission for that group. And ultimately, that's what you're going to be managing. If you really get granular about your delegation, you're going to have a lot of individual entries there. Yes, I'm about to change 31 permissions. Ouch. I hate that you have to do it that way, but that is the way the thing sort of rolls up at the end of the day, and that's what it looks like, and that's what you'll have to manage. The reason you should think about that is our whole topic is how to design your permissions model. And one of the things you've got to think about is if your permissions model design, if the approach you choose to take is going to be really granular permissions, then you're going to have to acknowledge that you're going to be having really complicated property sheets to deal with. And part of your design approach is going to have to be how to deal with those things. Maybe how you document those on paper so that other folks can come in and figure out what you did, and just understanding that you've got to go through and be able to look at those things in that fashion. That's just kind of the downside to doing it, but it's something you have to take into account as you create your overall approach. Now, as you're delegating permissions, there's something else you need to keep in mind. If you delegate the ability to create child objects or delete child objects, then something called Active Directory quotas can come into play. And these work a lot like file system quotas. What it's designed to do is mitigate the risk of a denial of service attack against Active Directory. So a quota simply means that when you delegate the permission to create new objects, when that person creates a new object, they become the owner of that object, and the quota limits how many new objects they create. That way, if their credential is compromised, a malicious attacker can't come in and just balloon the Active Directory database with bogus objects. They're going to be limited to what their quota allows them to create. Now, there are some exemptions to quotas. Schema partitions are exempt from quota restrictions. Modifications to the schema are already highly restricted. You have to be a member of the schema admins group, so it's already kind of protected. Also, members of the built-in domain admins and enterprise admins groups are exempt from quota limitations, and that's because those are the groups that normally are creating all of the objects in Active Directory. You don't want to limit those because that's really their whole job. So quotas are contained here in the NTDS quotas container. And if you right-click this and look at its properties and go to the attribute editor, there's two attributes in here you're really going to focus on. The first is the default quota, and that's the quota that essentially applies to whatever objects they create. So you can set a default quota for every security principal in a given partition. So to set a default quota for all security principals, you would modify this attribute. The other is the tombstone quota, which you can see here is set to 100 by default. Tombstone objects are what's created when you delete an object. They count toward the security principal's quota limit. But what you can do here is define the percentage by which tombstone objects count against that limit. So what I'm saying here is that when you delete an object, there's a tombstone that's created, and it exists for several days, and that tombstone counts 100% toward your quota. I can modify that and say that tombstone objects don't count against your quota, or that they only count 50% against your quota. And so this allows me to give you the ability to delete something even if you're at quota, and perhaps eventually create new objects. Again, keeping in mind that the idea behind quotas is not so much to restrict your users as it is to protect against a malicious attack. That's when you want to set this. If you've delegated permission to someone and they hit their quota for some reason, it's easy enough for you to go in and raise their quota. And that gives you an opportunity to say, okay, you've filled up your limit. Let me just make sure that you filled up your limit and not some malicious process that's gotten hold of your credentials. So you as a domain admin can go in and check and say, yeah, okay, it's fine. And you can raise their individual limit. So what I've done is modified the tombstone quota percentage for all security principals in the domain. So how could I specify a quota for some individual person? Well, you would not do it here in Active Directory users and computers. I'm going to need to open a command line shell. A command line shell, please. And I'm going to need to use the ds add client tool. So let's just do a quick example. ds add, and the first thing you're going to specify here is the partition. So, one dash partition. And this is DC equals company, DC equals, what did I name my domain? Local. So that's the partition. The next thing you're going to specify is the quota limit. So Q limit. And the quota limit, let's just set it at 10 objects. So this is the maximum number of objects. It's not a size thing. And now what account am I going to do that for? And this is where you would specify the canonical name of the account. Don J, DC equals, that's in the users container, DC equals company, DC equals local. And I might not have gotten that right, but let's see. Hit the enter. Oh, it looks like not. Oh, I left out a keyword. DC ds add quota. There we go. Great, succeeded. So what are the quota actions? Well, a quota enforcement occurs whenever that user now tries to add an object. So it will automatically debit from that 10 until I run out. And if I try to perform an operation and I don't have anything left in my quota, then the add operation will fail. If you reanimate an object, such as reanimating a tombstone, that's also subject to quota enforcement. And if you change the owner of an object, the ownership change causes the quota tracking system to decrement from the new owner's quota and give back to the old owner's quota. So pretty straightforward stuff. Now, it's also possible to use the ds-get command to view your quota limits. So you can very quickly pull down a list of quota limits. For example, let's see, it would be ds-get user, and then you're going to specify the user. Canonical name equals Don J, canonical name equals users, DC equals company, DC equals local. So that specifies the user you want. You then need to specify the partition that they're in. So that's the domain name again. And then you ask to get the Q limit and Q used. So that user's limit is 10, and they've used 0 objects of that 10. So that's how you can check that thing out. Now, it is possible to run this command multiple times and wind up applying multiple quotas to the same security principle. So if a security principle, let's say, isn't covered by a quota, then the effective quota for that is whatever the default quota is. But if they're covered by at least one quota specification, then that is applicable and the default isn't applied. So if you apply a specific one, then it overrides the default. But it's also possible to put more than one quota specification in here. And the effective quota is the maximum of the assigned quotas. So let's say you've got user A, they've got 2 quotas assigned, one is 5 and the other is 10. The effective quota is the quota with the higher limit, meaning it's 10. They're not additive. And that can be a real troubleshooting thing, and that's why you want to know how to use this ds-get command so that you can see all of the quota specifications. And you're pretty much going to be doing that with the ds-get command. And you can see I did add one in here. Once I added it from the command line, it does show up in here. So if we look at the properties for this on the attribute editor, we should be able to get down to the quota amount and see that it's 10. So once it's created, you can also come in and view it and edit it here. I find it a little bit easier to do it from the command line, just because if this person has 2 specifications, they're going to have 2 entries in this list, and it's easy to kind of miss You know, you're looking for their name, you scroll through, you see the first one, you're happy, you let it alone. You don't realize there's a second one in there. Whereas the command line would pull both of those out because you're specifying the full user path. So that's AD quotas. One of the next things you're going to have to do as you start delegating permissions to folks is get them some admin tools so that they can exercise those permissions. And if you just want to give someone the basic built-in Windows tools, the easiest way to get those is to go to download.microsoft.com, get to the Download Center, punch in RSAT, Remote Server Administration Toolkit. And there's several versions of this, and they're specific to the client version of the operating system. So here's the one, RSAT for Windows 8, RSAT for Windows 7, RSAT for Windows Vista, whatever else. So you're just going to download the right set. Now that will give them every administrative tool for the entire server, all of them, DHCP, DNS, Active Directory, everything. But it's okay. They can still only do what they have permission to do. Simply giving them the tool doesn't give them any extra permissions. And so you really want to lock things down at the permissions level. Now, you can definitely use something like Windows PowerShell to create little custom scripts or functions or even little custom GUI tools that are much, much more restricted. But creating that kind of customized delegation tool is beyond the scope of what we're going to cover in this nugget. What we're really covering is the idea of getting the back-end permissions delegated so that you can give them any tool and they can only do the things you've allowed them to do. And there are certain things you can't delegate in quite the usual way. So every Active Directory domain has an object called admin SD, security descriptor holder, admin SD holder. And it lives in the system container of the domain. So because I've enabled advanced features, I can see the system container. Here it is. And here's the admin SD holder container. And so that's the properties we're going to look at. Now, what this thing does is it has its own unique access control list. And that is used to control the permissions of security principals that are members of built-in privileged groups. Every single hour in Active Directory, a background process runs on your PDC emulator domain controller. It compares the ACL on all of your users, groups, and computers that belong to a protected group against the ACL of this admin SD holder. So you can think of admin SD holder as kind of a template permission. If the permission is different, then the security descriptor on admin SD holder gets recopied to those security principles, overwritten. So it's designed to ensure that those specialized users always retain their correct permissions. So to see what those permissions are, you would go to the Properties tab and go over to Security, just like normal. I don't think I actually clicked it. There we go. Security. So the trick is, if you want to change the permissions on a user object that is a member of, for example, domain admins or enterprise admins, you can't just go modify it directly on that user. Because it's a member of those special groups, Active Directory is going to want to enforce this set of permissions. So if you need to change those permissions, then you need to come in and change them here so that you're changing that template. Now, the groups that are protected, there's quite a lot of them. Let's go over to the users container where these built-in groups live. I'm just going to kind of read through them for you. Administrators, domain admins, enterprise admins, and schema admins. So let's see if we can find those guys on here. Administrator, domain admins, enterprise admins, and schema admins. You've also got account operators. That's going to be a local group for folks. Backup operators, your cert publishers group, there's cert publishers. Your domain controllers group is going to be in there as well, right there, domain controllers. Your print operators should be down in here. PQ, or that's a local group, right? Print operators is a local group. Replicator, schema admins, we said that, and server operators are all protected. Also, your server, I said server operators, and that's a local group. I think that should be it. There is a read-only domain controllers group also, and so members of that are protected. And yeah, that should be the majority of them. So you've got a lot of different protected groups that are affected by that admin SD holder. Just be aware that that's what it is and that's how it works. And if you're going to modify it, then that's how you have to modify it. The last major thing we need to talk about is delegation. Now, this requires an understanding, at least a high-level understanding, of how the Kerberos authentication protocol works. If you're not already familiar with that, I've done a free micro nugget that you can download, how Kerberos works. You can watch that, and that'll kind of give you the background. So the idea behind delegation is that you are a user, so this is you over here, and you've logged on to your computer. And by logging on, you've created a ticket for yourself, a ticket granting ticket, as well as tickets for all the resources that you need to directly access. So let's say you needed to get some information off this server. You would have a Kerberos ticket that allow you to access that particular server. Sometimes, though, you need to have a computer do work on your behalf. It might be a service that's running on your local computer that you need to go out and do something on your behalf. Or let's say this is a web server, and you're accessing that web server, and you need whatever the web application is to go get some data out of a SQL server. And the way your organization is set up is so that the web server needs to use your credential to go to SQL Server, so that SQL will only serve up the data you have permission to, without the web server having to worry about those permissions. Well, that's called delegation. You have delegated your ticket or your credential to the web server so that it can go do work on your behalf. Configuring Kerberos delegation is fairly complicated. So there's a couple of bits we need to look at here. Now, delegation is primarily intended to be used for service accounts, although computer accounts are enabled for them by default as well. That's why when you come into a computer account and you look at its properties, you'll see a delegation tab, and by default, computers are not trusted for delegation. The next level is to trust the computer for delegation to any service, and this is not a recommended configuration. It's a little too broad, and it can create some security issues. Instead, the recommendation is to use constrained delegation. Trust this computer for delegation only to the specified services that need it. And there's a sub-option here, whether or not you want to use Kerberos or any authentication protocol. Now, that second choice gets into something called protocol transition, which we'll talk about in just a sec. You would then add the services that can present delegated credentials. Now, if you do this on a user account, by default, you aren't going to see a delegation tab. And again, that's because it's primarily service accounts that are intended to be used with this. So if you've created a user account and it is a service account, then you need to register an SPN or service principal name. And the way you would do that is to go to a command line, and run the set SPN utility. So you're going to use set SPN to register a service principal name for the service account. Once you do that, then you'll be able to pick up that delegation tab for the user account, and you'll be able to trust that account for delegation as well. So let's talk about some of the nitty-gritty details here. Now, in order for that prior example I showed you to work, the user has to authenticate to the domain using Kerberos. That gives the user a Kerberos ticket. That ticket can then be delegated to this computer, which can then use it on behalf of the user. Here's the problem, though. Particularly, and this is a good example, because particularly in a situation where you're going to a web server, you're not necessarily authenticating with Kerberos. The user might actually be coming in over basic authentication or maybe using one of those little RSA numeric IDs. The point is, the web server knows who the user is, but because the user didn't use Kerberos, the user doesn't have a Kerberos ticket. So if the user is authenticated with forms-based logon, NTLM, something else, so if you're going to enable this transitional protocol, this protocol transition, what has to happen is the web server has to go get a ticket for this user by itself. Since the user didn't bring a ticket, the web server has to go get one. So you can configure a service account or a computer account to perform protocol transition, and that's that second radio button I just showed you, where it said using any authentication protocol. That lets the service, or in this case it would be the computer account for the web server, request a service ticket to a service without actually having one from the user. So in lieu of presenting the user's ticket to the website or whatever, the service account would present its own ticket granting ticket and request a service ticket in the name of the user. So here's the sequence that kind of, the steps it follows, I guess. Let's clear this out and start fresh. Okay, first thing that happens, the user authenticates using some non-Kerberos mechanism. So step one, they've logged on using forms-based authentication, let's say. Step two, and out here we've also got a domain controller. I need to add that to my drawing. Step two, the web server presents its ticket granting ticket, its Kerberos TGT, to the domain controller and requests a service ticket for that user for whatever service it is they need to access. So the KDC evaluates the delegation settings for the web server, checks to see that it's trusted for delegation, and checks to see that it's trusted for any authentication protocol. And if it works, then it sends that service ticket back to the web server. The server then presents that new ticket to the KDC. So it sends it back to the KDC and says, hey, I need a service ticket for my SQL server over here. Now the DC is just operating like it would in any normal circumstances. It looks at the delegation settings again. If it's properly configured, then the service ticket for the SQL server comes back, and that allows the web server to present that service ticket to the SQL server to get whatever access or resources it needs. The SQL server thinks that the user is accessing the SQL server, so it's going to present whatever data and functionality the user has permission to perform. So this isn't that uncommon of a setup, but not setting it up properly is what causes most administrators a lot of grief. So understanding those two settings in Active Directory users and computers is the starting point for making delegation work. But it is just the starting point. You see, in order for the service account to be able to get the information, the service account must be able to access the group membership of the user, right? Because if you're gonna pretend to be a user, then in the example I gave you, the SQL server needs to know what groups the user is a member of. That way, it can set up its permissions properly. You know, some of the permissions you have might come from groups rather than you. So to construct that service ticket, the service account is going to have to be able to access the group membership of the user that it's trying to get a service ticket through, and that is going to come by making the service account a member of the Windows Authorization Access Group. So in addition to the service account being trusted for delegation, it needs to be added to that particular user group. That group, in turn, has been delegated read access to the token groups global and universal attribute in Active Directory. Next, to actually perform that delegated information, the service account needs one of the special user rights. It needs the right act as part of the operating system, which under the hood is called SETCB privilege. And it also needs the, impersonate a client after authentication, which is SE impersonate privilege. Now, the first one, act as part of the operating system privilege, is especially sensitive, and by default, it's only granted to the built-in system account. If you grant this right to a service account, then an attacker who compromises that would gain full control of the entire server. So normally, applications that make large-scale use of this protocol transition, such as single sign-on tools, have a special service that runs under the system account to perform the necessary Kerberos calls on behalf of their application. That way, you're not assigning that act as part of the operating system privilege to a whole mess of accounts, which could then increase your attack surface or your ability to be compromised. So I think we've covered everything we needed to. We looked at the basics of working with permissions, talked about delegating control using the delegation of control wizard, or just manually putting in permissions if that's what you want to do, how to configure Kerberos delegation. We did talk about Active Directory quotas, getting those client tools deployed, and the admin SD holder role. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.